Hello friends, today's topic of discussion is alternative Hindi cinema, and in the earlier lecture in which we talked about the alternative Hindi cinema, we talked about some of the features or characteristics of the alternative Hindi cinema. We also talked about the precursors of the alternative Hindi cinema, where we see that the filmmakers like Bimal Roy, for example, who made Udair Pathe. Then we also talked about K. Abbas and Chetan Anand, who made Nichanagar. Chetan Anand, who made Nichanagar, and K. Abbas, who made Dharti Ke Lal. In their films, that how these films they were talking about the issues of inequality, poverty, etc. in the society. And all these kinds of issues, they were being tackled in these particular kind of films. And we also talked about some of the filmmakers from post-independence, where we talked about Satyajit Ray and how the cinema of Satyajit Ray was also very relevant from the point of view that it was trying to convey the kind of problems which were existent in the society. And we also talked about Ghatak, that how Ritwik Ghatak during his times when he made films, and especially his trilogy largely was dealing with the issue of partition, and the migration from eastern part of Bengal to the western part of Bengal was very painful for Ritwik Ghatak, and he always felt that this kind of a trauma which he had to encounter because of the partition, and he was always rooted in eastern Bengal from that point of view. And this kind of a situation of Ghatak was reflected in the films which were made by him, whether Megha Katara, Swarna Rekha, etc. All these films, they try to convey the kind of problems which were there in the society, and Ghatak largely feels, whether it was Swarna Rekha as well, in all these three films, where Ghatak is trying to see partition as some kind of a particular loss or a personal loss for him. Then we also see that in many of the films which were made by Ghatak during this time, they were talking about the kinds of issues which were very relevant for the society, and scholars like John Hood, they talk that how the nostalgia for the once undivided Bengal and the pain which was coming out of the displacement and the rootlessness is clearly evident in the films which were made by Ghatak. Then he was also closely related to the cultural trauma of 1947, which became very acute for him, and he was not able to reconcile with that kind of a trauma. And Eric O'Donnell has argued that Ghatak argued that how partition struck roots of Bengali culture. So scholars, they have tried to study Ghatak, and how they have also pointed out that this kind of a loss which was faced by Ghatak during this time, and how the partition during this particular period was also striking at the roots of the Bengali culture as well. This was being felt by Ghatak. So he in a way was reflecting his anxiety as well, to find out some kind of a root or a refuge as well. And when we tend to see his cinema, we definitely come to this kind of a conclusion that this kind of a rootlessness, this kind of a desire to find any kind of a refuge is clearly evident in the various characters, those who are performing in his films. And many of the scholars, they say that the Ghatak's quest as a refugee for a new identity could be seen in a larger context of an effort at depicting the relationships among the new classes which were created by the process of urbanization and the machine revolution, and their old way of life. And Ashish Rajyadhyaksha has talked about from this particular point of view. And when you talk about filmmakers like Mrinal Sen, who was a committed filmmaker, and he was associated with the Indian People's Theatres Association, and many a times we find that many of the films which were made by him, they were overtly political as well, and his films for the most part do not provide a happy ending or a definitive conclusion as well. So from that point of view, we find that how Mrinal Sen was very significant or important from that point of view, and the kind of cinema which was made by Mrinal Sen was also talking about the concerns of that particular period. And for that we also find that he was able to secure a number of awards as well. And these awards are not only reflective of the kind of work which was done by him, but they were also in a way some kind of a recognition from the government at different levels, whether he got it the Dada Saheb Phalke Award in 2003 or he was made as an honorary member of the Rajya Sabha. So all this was some kind of an acceptance by the government or the people, those who are there in power, in terms of the kind of work which was done by Mrinal Sen. Then we also see that the kind of movement which was in a way initiated in the films, which was referred to as the new cinema, that was the kind of a movement which could be seen in the films which were made in India, and how Bhuvan Shom was the first film from 1969 in which Suhasini Moole and Utpal Dutt they acted, and this film deals with the ideas of monotony, solitude, camaraderie and compassion, and this also highlights the rural-urban divide in India. And finally, we find that how the self-realization of the protagonist is very, very important in this film, where he realizes when during the course of the film that there is much more in life than to the kind of discipline in which he was living. And Amitabh Bachchan, as the narrator of the film, was able to leave that kind of a mark in this particular film. We also see that various kinds of committees which were established during this time, as you can see on the screen as well, the Film Inquiry Committee 1949, in which S.K. Patil was the chairman of this committee. And this committee was also critical of the way the film industry was operating, the kind of organization, financing, selection and the handling of the themes, and the availability of the trained personnel, and the kind of conduct in which the people they were engaged in the supply of the goods and services. So all this was in a way being taken into account by this particular committee, and they suggested ways and means by which they could make some kind of a difference as well. And in that context, we find that how it also talked about establishing a film finance corporation to give kind of a chief finance to the films which were to be made, and an institution was to be created to train actors and technicians as well. So the kind of suggestions which were made by the committee in the framework of the formation of the National Film Awards to honor the remarkable work in cinema, and we find that awards were instituted in 1953, and we also see that the Central Board of Film Censors in 1952, CBFC was set up in Bombay with regional offices in Madras and Calcutta. So earlier we find that how Indian cinema was being guided by the Cinematograph Act, which was there in 1918. And this Cinematograph Act, the Indian Cinematograph Act, which was introduced by the British, their concerns were comparatively different from the Central Board of Film Censors. And as the Central Board of Film Censors came up with new kinds of guidelines, they also took into account the kind of work which was being done by the Indian Cinematograph Act, the various kinds of provisions which were there, they were being also scrutinized. And then we find that this board came. And later we find that in 1983 it was referred to as the Central Board of Film Certification, because now the issue was not in the framework of the censorship, rather the issues was converted in the framework of the certification. Then we also find that how the government also established the Film Finance Corporation, which merged with the Motion Picture Export Association in 1980 to form the National Film Development Corporation for financing and exporting the films. And when you talk about the various filmmakers and the kind of films which were being made by these filmmakers, then we realize that the kind of work with which they were able to do was also being supported by the institutions which were made by the government, whether in the framework of providing some kind of finance to them or in the framework of the Film Institute, FTII, or National Film Archives of India. And both these institutions which were set up in Pune, and how they have played an important role in terms of harnessing the talents of so many generations. And when you talk about the film archives, we find that so many people they contributed to the film archives, and P.K. Nair, who was the director of the archives, was an important person who was closely associated in terms of preserving the kind of film heritage which was available in India. Then these kinds of institutions, we also find that they also were the academic and the training grounds for the budding filmmakers of those times. And we also see that how in 1973 the Directorate of Film Festivals was set up to organize an annual international film festival as well. So in that context, when we see that how when film festivals they are being organized in India, then a number of films from even different countries, they could be exhibited in India, and the kind of interaction which takes place when people from across the world they visit the film festivals, and they have some kind of a constructive exchange of ideas in these film festivals. Apart from watching films, we also listen to the kind of films which are made by these filmmakers, and many times we also listen to the filmmakers, those who have made these films, with any particular kind of an idea. So their mindset, their ideas, their concerns with regard to making of films, they are also known to the audience, and it is a huge kind of a development in the framework of the cinematic studies, that when one is able to talk to the filmmakers, then they get to know about their mindset. As the author of a book, similarly we find that film also has authors. They are seen as auteur theory, where they are seen to be as authors of that particular film, and how some kind of a professional kind of an interaction which takes place. For example, we find that Ritvik Ghatak was a professor at the FTII, though he could not get that kind of recognition when he was alive, and the kind of recognition which came to him through his films was comparatively later, when his films they were comparatively lauded more, which was not happening when he was alive. And we find that Ghatak's films Nagarik, which was made in 1952, was perhaps the earliest of a Bengali art film, and preceding the Pather Panchali of Satyajit Ray by 3 years. But this was not released until his death in 1977, and we find that these kinds of filmmakers, they wanted to provide some kind of a new language to the film medium, and the kind of changes which were brought about in the cinema of the 1970s and the 1980s, they were also very, very significant. And that cinema was also trying to experiment with the new themes or the new ideas, and the kind of treatment which was being given to the films of this particular period, it was also talking about the concerns of those particular times. And then we find that the filmmakers like Mani Kaul, who graduated from FTII, who became also a teacher in the film studies, he started his career with Uski Roti in 1969, which also gave him the Filmfare Critics Award for the best film. And he also won the National Film Award for the Best Direction for Duvidha, which he made in 1974, and also later the National Film Award for the documentary film Siddheshwari in 1989. So when you talk about this kind of a cinema, these kinds of films which were made by the filmmakers, Mani Kaul, Kumar Sahani, all of them, and when we find that Mani Kaul's film Uski Roti, it was based on a short story by Mohan Rakesh, who also wrote the dialogues for the film as well, and this was one of the main films of the new Indian cinema, and it was also a departure from the earlier Indian cinema technique, form and narrative, where we find that it was also trying to dispense altogether with the plot in the usual sense as well. And then it could also be seen as one of the early formal experimental films in Indian cinema, where we find that not any established film actors they were being used in this particular film. And the film also does not have many of the dialogues, and the way they are being delivered is also very undramatic in nature. They are in that sense, they are film reminiscent of the films of Bresson. And we also find that the cinematography by K.K. Mahajan, it dwells on the faces, hands and the exteriors, in the mud walls, in the windswept highway, a guava orchard, and so they in a way are emphasizing on the hands is particularly Bressonian in nature. Then when you see the ideas of these filmmakers, those who are making such kind of a cinema, for example, Mani Kaul said in 1994 that when he made this film Uski Roti, he wanted to completely destroy any semblance of a realistic development, so that he could construct film almost in manner of a painter. and the film depicts the life of a truck driver and his wife, and the female protagonist has to get male protagonist's food ready every day, and she has to walk a long distance through the fields, and she waits for him on highway as he drives past villages. So the film largely talks about the life of the common people, how the life of a truck driver and his wife, it is being shown, and it is being shown in a very simple manner. It is not in a way projected or portrayed in a manner where you will find a lot of imagination. Rather, we find that they are being shown in a very mundane kind of a manner. Every day to day reality is being exhibited, and we also see that how the driver is leading an independent life, playing cards with the friends and spending time with his mistress, and he's coming home only once a week, and he's also expecting his wife to play the traditional role. And one day when wife gets late, then he's very angry and he drives away without the food, and then she decides to wait for him until midnight. So we find that such kind of film was very new to the Indian audience, because most of the time they were expecting something very spectacular. They were expecting something which would not happen in a very day-to-day affairs of people. So they were trying to expect certain things which would be very new. But we find that such kind of portrayals, in that sense, they were very mundane, they were very day to day, so which was also not accepted by many of the audience. In many times we find that these films they were not successful from the commercial point of view. Then Money Calls, another film, Ashad Ka Ek Din, in 1971. It was based on the debut Hindi play by Mohan Rakesh in 1958. And this play received a Sangeet Natak Academy Award for the best play in 1959, and Money Call made a film on this and also won the Filmfare Critics Award for the best film of that year. And this film was based on the idea that how, when you try to see, it was trying to focus on the Kalidas' life sometime in 100 BCE or 400 CE period. So that was the period on which this film was trying to focus upon. And if you see the earlier times, we see that before this particular film was made based on this particular play. So before it, the Hindi plays, they were either idealistic or didactic in nature. They were devoid of the connection with the contemporary reality. Also, their language remained language of literature, which wasn't suitable for stage. But this play changed it all, because the way this play was written, so it was trying to break away all sorts of convention. As I told you that it was based on the Kalidas' life, and sometime it was referring to the time when one is talking about or referring to the time period, then it was somewhere around 100 BCE or 400 CE period. So from that point of view, we find that it was trying to, this particular play was trying to narrate or trying to present itself in a different manner, which was not in consonance with the earlier plays, and because of which we find that it was being adapted in terms of making the film. And we find that when you talk about the portrayal in this film, then we find that how Kalidas is leading a peaceful life in the Himalayan village and is romantically involved with Mallika, and he is invited to appear at King Chandragupta II's court in Ujjaini. And so he is torn between the current idyllic existence and love on the one hand, and desire to achieve greatness on the other. He lives in a conflicted state of mind. So this was one film which was talking about that particular kind of an era. And then we also see that Money Call made a film called Duvidha, which was a ghost film which was set in rural Rajasthan. And this was based on the story by Vijayadan Detha, which relates a popular folk tale from Rajasthan about a merchant's son whose relationship with his young bride is upset by his work, and a ghost who falls in love with her, resulting in ghost impersonating husband. So we find that this film was largely shot in the village Borunda in Tehsil Bilara, Jodhpur district, village of author Vijayadan Detha, who was also known as Bijji. And the music of the film was by the folk musicians of Rajasthan, Ramzan Hammu, Latif and Saki Khan. And if you have seen another film called Paheli, which was made by Amol Palekar in 2005, So this was based on the same story. So this film is trying to, in a way, narrate a rural tale or a folk tale of Rajasthan, and it was the way the film was being presented to the audience, where a ghost is trying to impersonate a human being because he is in love with the wife of that person, and when the ghost is able to impersonate, and ghost is living a life of that human being within the same house, and nobody is able to identify. So it was that kind of an idea which was very new to the people, and it was also trying to talk about not only the tales or the stories which are relating to the elite audience. Rather, this film was talking in the framework of the common masses. And thereafter, apart from Money Call, we also find that another filmmaker who is also being considered to be quite equal to Money Call was the Kumar Sahani, and he made films like Maya Darpan in 1972 and Khayal Gatha in 1989. And how he was also dedicated to formalism, and Maya Darpan is being considered Indian cinema's first formalist film. And the formalist film theory, when one is talking about that, the focus of the formalist film theory is on the formal elements or the technical aspects of this particular film, and the lighting, the scoring, and the sound and the set design, the use of the colors, shot composition and editing, all of them, they are being in a way emphasized in when one is talking, when one is making the formalist film. So the formal elements of a particular film are these, and these are the focus. These are the focus of this particular film. Then we also see that when one is talking about the various kinds of theories, whether in the framework of formalism, that how things they feel, or in the framework of classicism, that how things they should look, or realism, that how things really look. So all these kinds of aspects, they are trying to convey the kind of reality which is there in the society. And we also see that he was also compared to similar stylistic filmmakers such as Paolo Pasolini and Andrei Tarkovsky. And if you talk about the Italian film director Roberto Rossellini and Robert Bresson, they were also major influences on his work as well. Thereafter, we also see that he made a film called Maya Darpan, Illusory Mirror, and it was a significant work of Indian parallel cinema movement. Though the film was forgotten soon after its release, but was rediscovered and is now considered a landmark work of the Indian cinema. So we find that some of the filmmakers, those who could not become popular in those times, and their films, they were also being lost to the audience in a certain manner. How when these films, they were being shown in the later times, and how they became popular, and their cinema was also considered to be classic in some sense. So when you talk about this film, we find that the way the kind of picturization which is there in the film, and the patriarchal setup of the society appears to very overbearing in the film. And we also see that the feudal order, and the film is talking about that kind of an order, and it is trying to create a new order in the society. And there's some kind of conflict in the female protagonist's mind, that whether to continue her upper class life by marrying or work for the lower classes. So that was the kind of thing which was seen in this particular film. Then he also made a film called Khayal Gatha, which is about the history of the Khayal genre of the Indian classical singing. And the film also traces the relationship of the Khayal genre with the Indian classical dance as well. And the film is presented in an abstract format, where a music student listens to the stories and legends about the birth and the evolution of the Khayal form of classical Indian singing. So we find that all these films which were talking about the various kinds of ideas which were new to the Hindi cinema in those times, and all these filmmakers, those who were not in a way given that kind of a due when they were making such kind of films, they were later recognized when their films, they were being curated by some of the critics, and then they realized that these films, they were not only some sort of wealth of information, but at the same time the kind of treatment which was being given to these films was completely new. And how the art cinema or the alternative Hindi cinema was trying to break the conventions of the mainstream popular cinema. So that these were the kind of ideas which were there in the alternative Hindi cinema. Thank you very much.